Hello everyone. Before we start, just a little word from me, Dan, to give you a heads up that there's going to be some swearing in this episode. Normally if we have the old curse word in an episode, I just edit around it. But these instances were so impassioned and meaningful that I thought it would be a shame to have to do that, because this is one of our more meaningful episodes. Okay, so please consider yourself warned. Here's the show.
Now the podcast starts.
Hello everyone. If this is your first time listening to the show, welcome. And if you're a returning listener, welcome back. And thanks for sticking with us. This show talks about horror, horror in film, horror in TV or other media, other items which we think of as adjacent to horror, and sometimes other things from our lives which we'd like to talk about just because that's who we are. This week we're beginning a two-part discussion on witchcraft and paganism in real life and film, with references to a number of specific horror films. We have a number of guests who vary week to week, but this week you've got us. I'm TD Velasquez, but you can call me Dan in Greater Manchester, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by
Stella Gaynor in Manchester.
And the person who has planned and conceived this two-part discussion herself.
Kirsty Warrow in Shropshire.
Thank you, Kirsty. Brilliant. Hello, folks. Everybody all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Can I just say, Dan, you conceived this. This was a thing that got, kind of mentioned early on in this podcast history, which has become slightly bigger. So I've planned it, but you conceived it, I think.
I will say that it arose from discussions between us. I think
yes.
it arose following the episode we did about Suspiria.
Yeah.
But I think it arose naturally. But yes, but you're the expert here and you've done the planning. So Thank you very much for that. Before we go on to that main topic, have we got items of news we'd like to discuss?
Yeah. I would like to flag up that Fright Fest, which is normally has three main events throughout the year. They've announced that their August bank holiday event is going to be fully online. So they're saying that it's now being called the Fright Fest Digital Edition. And there'll be 25 films available from Friday the 28th to Monday the 31st. And there'll also be free things that you can have a look at online as well. And I was looking at it myself because I was trying to buy tickets for myself and my friends. And the tickets go online available from the 1st of August. And it will be locked for UK viewers only, But yeah, Fright Fest have officially said they are going online. But it should be good. Previous Fright Fests have been wonderful. It's connected with Arrow Video and the Horror Channel. So if you want to sit around on the August bank holiday weekend and watch some excellent horror films, then I definitely recommend this year's Fright Fest.
Oh, fantastic. So yeah, I wouldn't normally get the chance to go to Fright Fest because it's in London. Yeah. But I might have the chance this year. That's great. Have you been before, Stella?
I've been once a few years ago. 3 years ago, I think, when I had some money because I was still being funded for my PhD. So I treated myself to a day at Fright Fest. That's the thing, the chance to be able to watch all the films from the comfort of my sofa and still in my pyjamas. I will take that opportunity. For sure.
I mean, that's one of the great things, isn't it, about a lot of these film festivals going online is just accessibility to those of us who can't often get to, big metropolitan centres.
Yeah.
So whilst it's really sad that these things can't happen in a physical way that they normally would, it's, the kind of the silver lining is that accessibility.
Yeah, I'd probably end up seeing more horror films at the horror film festivals this year than I normally would. So that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, oh, that's brilliant. I'll put a link on the show notes for this to Fright Fest and where you can book tickets. That's great. I have a little bit of news, although it's not news really, but I kind of wanted to say it because it follows up on a recommendation that came out from Stella a few weeks ago, which was What We Do in the Shadows.
Yay!
I'd never seen it before, and over the last week I've absolutely mainlined almost the entire series and the film and the original 2005 short film.
This is lovely.
Based on.
And you love it?
No, I think it's rubbish.
Oh!
No, I'm absolutely delighted and addicted to it, and I'm a little bit frightened that I've only got 2 episodes left. It's so good, and I'm so glad that I did ask the question when Stella, your recommendation came up, and I said, do I need to have seen the film? And you technically don't, but Kirsty, you did say, no, watch the film and then watch the series.
Yeah.
So I watched the film on Amazon Prime, and although there isn't a direct narrative connection to the series, certain things that come up later in the show are so much more satisfying if you have seen the film.
Yeah.
And it's really, really funny.
Mm-hmm.
I love all of those actors in both the film and the TV show. It's different casts. And I think the reason that I've taken quite a long time to get round to it is because even when the original film came out, the premise of the show seemed a little bit second-hand. 3 vampires sharing a flat.
Yeah.
It reminded me of Being Human, which is a show that we've never mentioned, which is a vampire, a ghost, and a werewolf share a flat in Bristol. And I used to quite like that show. But What We Do in the Shadows is much sillier, and it has a very different kind of charm. And I just very quickly fell in love with it. And there's something remarkable about the series that, in addition to the premise being, really light and easy to get into, and the main characters being stunning, and I love the fact that in both the film and the TV series that are about 3 vampires living in a flat or house together. But in the TV show, there's a 4th vampire who is the energy vampire, Colin Robinson. Who is possibly...
so good.
I
think he might be my favourite character ever.
Well, a friend of mine's just got a puppy, and he's called it Colin Robinson. Which I love.
That's fantastic. He's basically they've created this idea of the energy vampire who appears to be a human being and can walk in the daylight and have a normal job and things, but just drains the energy from other people by boring them to death or making them feel awkward in some way.
Oh, it's
I love the idea that he's the kind of internet troll as well.
It's
just perfect.
He's got all the laptops set up on his bed. He's got like 3 or 4 on the go at the same time. It's so good.
So good.
I think my favourite thing is occasionally when they cut to him and he's quietly draining someone without anyone else having noticed, and there's just this look of delight on his face. It's just extraordinary. And I love basically every couple of episodes there's a great new spin they do on the concept. The fact that they can all turn into bats, so therefore there becomes an episode where one of them gets captured by animal services and put in a cage at the animal welfare home and things like that. And the actors who turn up without giving away too many surprises, because the surprise is part of the delight. But Mark Hamill,
brilliant.
Turns up as a hooded vampire, and he turns up at a point in the series where you've kind of almost got used to being surprised by a wonderful guest star, and you're thinking, who's that hooded person? And then he takes the hood off. It's like, oh, it's Luke Skywalker with fangs and a great kind of mock Slavic accent. There's so much that's just lovable about it. I think it's fantastic.
I'm going to watch it again. I think it needs several watches because, like you said, there's so much in it and there's so many details and layers. It definitely needs a rewatch. So
can I suggest as well that it's a focused for a future episode. Yeah,
I think
Look
we
at
can
the
do that,
detail,
can't we?
yeah.
definitely do that.
I think we've got the ammunition.
We do.
Brilliant.
Yeah. I'll write that down.
Just to let the listeners know, I think when we recommended it the other week, the film was on BBC iPlayer.
Yeah.
And it's not anymore, but it is on Amazon Prime if you got that, which is where I found it.
Yeah.
The whole 2 series are still on the iPlayer.
Yeah.
And you can find the short film on YouTube.
Yeah.
So it's all out there.
Yeah.
Can I just say as well that on
And,
the Blu-ray DVD, they've got some lovely special features, including Viago and what's the Jermaine Clement one called? I've forgotten.
Oh, he's called
Yes.
Vladislav.
Yeah, Vladislav. They go to a vampire festival
All
somewhere
right.
in Europe. I think in Italy. It's very funny.
Okay.
Good.
Is that a special feature on the DVD of the
Yes.
film? Or the
The
TV show?
DVD with the
Okay.
film.
Right, okay.
Yeah,
Cool,
so there's
that's
lovely
fantastic.
little bits like that, and some kind of
No, I love
extra
those
little
characters.
Yeah,
I love the way they kind of, Vladislav is basically Vlad the Impaler,
Yeah.
isn't he? But he's kind of gone to seed. I love the moment where they say, he used to be great, and he could turn into any animal, but now
yeah. You can't get
he
their
never
faces.
gets the faces quite. And there's just this bit where you pan across and you see a
Yeah.
cat with Jermaine Clement's face on it.
So
I think
good.
that was the moment where I just thought, I'm in. This is
Yeah,
completely
this is for
got
me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was like the
No, that's
leave me to do my dark bidding. What are you bidding on? A table.
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
It is
Anyway.
fantastic.
Anyway, witches.
So,
Yeah.
yes. So,
Which that's a nice segue. There is a witch episode, isn't there, in season 2, where
Yeah.
they get
Smoothly
witches.
done.
Yeah.
oh, and yes, and just before we move on, because it's a kind of a news item, one of my other favourite characters in the show is the LARPer girl who gets vampirised,
Yes.
played by
Beanie
Feldstein.
Yeah, he's great.
And she is playing Catelyn Moran in the film of Catelyn Moran's How to Be a Girl,
Yeah.
which is coming out. And I love the idea of her speaking with the Birmingham accent, but it's just great. I just always feel kind of so out of touch. I discover something and think it's new, and then discover that the people are all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I'd
she
never
is
heard of her
everywhere.
before I saw this show. But she's fantastic. So, yeah. All right. Well, everybody, let's move on to our main discussion of this episode, and indeed probably next week's episode as well. And I should just let the listeners know that in discussing witchcraft and paganism in real life and in relation to horror and horror films, we will be talking in a lot of detail about a number of key films. And to be fair, there are probably going to be a lot of spoilers, because it's probably difficult to discuss the representation of the witch or pagan characters in the movies without discussing the whole of the movie.
Yeah.
So just be aware for this week, if anybody hasn't seen The Witch and would like to, 2015's The Witch, directed by Robert Eggers, go away and watch it before you listen to this, because we'll be talking about it. And also we'll do detailed discussions of Ari Aster's Midsommar from last year, and the original The Wicker Man from 1973. And there's probably a lot of other films that will come up in the discussion that we might spoil as well, to be fair. But those are the ones we're going to spoil in detail, I think. And at this point, I'll hand over to Kirsty, because Kirsty, this is an area that you have a great interest in and expertise upon.
Apparently. I mean, aside from being interested in horror films from an academic, scholarly direction, and as a film fan, I also kind of identify as a witch, as a pagan. But just, kind of preparing for this, it's actually that sort of saying that is quite difficult, because my identification in that way is kind of 25 years old now, probably. And there have been times when, it's often felt not safe to say those things, to sort of come out of the broom cupboard is what we call it.
Nice.
Yeah. So, so saying it on public record is kind of a little bit scary. So, but also it's, the kind of communities that I'm going to talk about, are really diverse, really, really super diverse, and they're not centralised. So I'm not going to sit here and, kind of talk about, kind of pagans and witches, or talk for them. I can't. But what I can do is talk about my perceptions of these films as somebody who identifies as being, kind of a witch, as a pagan. But I'm also, cisgender and female and white. So those also kind of inform the way that I've looked at these films and the way I've responded to the films. So that's before we start, I think. And then I think from what this discussion has sort of, kind of not turned into, but is there's a distinction between talking about what is a witch and what is a pagan. And that's kind of, I think, why we need to do this across 2 weeks, is so that they don't kind of get all conflated, because it's a bit messy. So if we start off with just kind of what is a witch, and so principally
that makes sense.
Witches tend to define themselves in 3 ways, and you'll find people who will use one to to identify themselves as a witch, or all 3, or a combination. So it's somebody who actively practices magical rituals or spells, somebody who has a spiritual ability, so somebody who considers themselves a psychic medium, or who does tarot reading, for example, or somebody who worships pagan deities. Originally, or the kind of traditional kind of notion of witchcraft is that often it's hereditary, so that it's kind of passed down through families, or it's a sort of mystery tradition, initiate tradition, so you become initiated into becoming a witch. But in the age of the internet and social media, people are increasingly coming to a pagan or witch identity through those kind of channels. And the kind of crucial thing is that it's people identifying as such. And in doing that can be a very empowering thing to sort of say, I am a witch, rather than have, and this has happened as well, people call you a witch because they think it's an insult. It's being used pejoratively. So there are lots of different types of witch identities, lots of different types of witches, but it is a term that has been more broadly and historically used by women, although not all witches are women. There are many male witches. And in this country and in America, there's a particular type of witchcraft which is called type of neo-paganism, which is called Wicca, which sort of originates in Britain, it becomes popular in the 1950s, but it starts a little bit earlier than that, through a guy called Gerald Gardner, who sort of formalised some of those earlier, kind of folkloric traditions, nature worship and, kind of spiritual rituals. So he kind of basically put a little bit more emphasis on, rather than having lots of gods and goddesses, a god, a goddess, and it was more of like an aspect religion and a ritual system, rather than something that's been a little bit more kind of free form and different in different places, if that makes sense. So that's what a witch is. So,
right.
Yeah. So that's kind of, maybe talk about the distinction between witches and pagans next time. Okay. If when we think about those things, but it's often difficult to talk about witches and witchcraft as a sort of single thing, because it isn't, and it means different things to different people, and people express their kind of witch identity differently, and they practice their witch identity differently. So any I'll keep talking otherwise.
I'll just say thank you very much, Kirsty, because that's absolutely fascinating. And I mean, I know what you're saying, because it surprised me that you define or one potential definition of a witch is somebody like a psychic medium. So obviously psychic mediums are relatively common. but whether or not those people, and I've met some and known some and write about some, but I never thought that they may define themselves as witches, although that never even occurred to me to ask. So maybe they do.
Yeah, and again, I think it depends on the tradition in which the kind of psychic ability sits. So obviously, you have spiritualist churches, so that's they're not necessarily identifying as witches, but if it exists within a kind of witchcraft cultural framework, then it's something that people do kind of identify, but they might identify that way and then not do the kind of rituals and spells, or not think about their relationship to any particular god. It's just about connection to a spiritual kind of the beyond the veil stuff. So
it also it kind of fascinated me that Wicca was relatively recent, a relatively recent phenomenon. I think you said it became popular in the 50s.
Yeah.
It goes back a little bit further. Obviously, it's based on much older traditions and things. But so, did Gerald Gardner coin the term Wicca?
I'm not sure where the term comes from, but one of the things that's kind of interesting with it is even within the kind of witch community, there's, Wicca, it seems to be like is the mainstream way of kind of becoming a witch, if you like. There's a kind of, initiation path, and, kind of people either fully kind of on board with Wicca or not. It tends to, it can be quite divisive, because it's a little bit more, or it can be quite dogmatic in terms of here are the things that you have to do in order to perform rituals, to kind of have a particular status within the kind of hierarchical structure. Right. And some people, kind of don't like that about it. They like, kind of slightly more eclectic approach, and a little bit more kind of driven by themselves. So again, this is why I'm not saying it's really difficult to kind of make pronouncements that kind of cover all witches, because it's every witch is different,
right,
and everybody practices slightly differently and places emphasis on different things within their own practice and their own spirituality. So
this is so interesting.
But again, I think the kind of logical place really to move it back into a kind of film media type discussion really is thinking about why witches present in such a really kind of actually quite limited and very negative ways within mainstream media generally. But within horror films specifically, and then that really kind of goes back to the way, the kind of history of witchcraft and the way in which witches were defined and then persecuted during the kind of witch purge. So the kind of witch hunts and the, kind of burnings of witches, which, kind of happened between, kind of 1450 to 1750. It's that kind of period, which ended up with about...
That's an incredibly long time.
It is a very, very long time, but we ended up with about 40,000 deaths, apparently, across Europe and the US. So to go back even further than that, it's the, kind of the around, in Europe before the Roman Empire came along, before they then, kind of adopted Christianity as a religion. Most, all European places had a more localized, kind of pagan belief system and culture. And again, we'll talk about this more next week, but those pagan belief structures are more kind of nature based and more about kind of worshipping the earth and kind of tuning yourself to the rhythms of the, of the kind of the turning of the wheel, as the seasons change. And so when Christianity got adopted, there was a kind of, a kind of move by the Pope and the papacy to try and make sure, or those kind of early Christian structures, to try and, propagate it across Europe. And so part of what they did is they started to put in, kind of festivals at the times when people were already celebrating. So Christmas is, 4 days after Yule, which is the winter solstice. festival when people were already celebrating. And then, the kind of other kind of key Christian festivals, both the kind of major ones and the lesser ones are all often kind of positioned where pagan festivals were or had been.
Is that why Easter moves around?
Yeah. Well, no, Easter moves around, doesn't it, in relation to, because actually the dates of the solstices and the kind of the festivals are actually fairly fixed, because they're to do with longest day, longest night, the equinoxes and all that kind of stuff. But there's even things like so the day after Halloween is it All Souls Day?
All Saints Day.
Yes. All Saints Day,
Same,
So, so there are lots of, but like even the word Easter and the kind of the symbols that we use around Easter, bunnies and eggs, they're not Christian symbols. They're symbols that have been.
There was no chocolate eggs in Jerusalem.
No. So they're all. It kind of works from a kind of Christian theology perspective in terms of what that festival represents, but it also works as being, this kind of early spring festival when we're starting to, think about the world, kind of nature coming back to life,
emerging from winter.
And the other big thing to kind of note is that the way in which the image of Satan gets developed, which kind of takes images that have become quite important, that were quite important to kind of pagan cultures, particularly the idea of the ram or the kind of goat or stag. And anything with horns, in paganism tends to be, linked to masculine power, and fertility and virility and all of that kind of stuff, and hunting, and those are quite important images in pagan traditions. But of course, that gets co-opted and kind of wrapped up into this image of Satan. So if you're worshipping a horned god, then very quickly you can be identified as worshipping Satan, because that is an identity that's imprinted upon that those older gods.
So I come from a Christian background, and I'm going to betray my own lack of knowledge about my supposed background here. I mean, I've just said that All Souls and All Saints Day are the same.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's actually true, but I've got a feeling they might actually be different days. But I don't know. But what I can ask you, Kirsty, is so does the Christian image of the devil as a horned man was that stolen from pagan traditions?
Yes.
or was it a coincidence?
No, it's not.
It's
not a coincidence. Definitely,
right, okay.
A kind of negative appropriation.
Okay.
So
so the devil existed before that,
yes,
but he was not imaged as a horned beast.
No.
Okay.
No. So that then leads into this, kind of the big kind of power shift that happens when there's during this kind of witch purge time, which is also the same time as kind of the scientific enlightenment is starting to kind of happen, and we're getting more kind of strength in academia, and kind of men just generally kind of going, look at me, I know stuff and I understand the world.
Nothing's changed, does it?
Yeah. But the kind of the underside of that is diminishing kind of women's power, and in kind of more rural communities for eons, women had been the kind of the glue that held those societies together, in terms of they were the midwives and they were the healers. They understood about how, what herbs to use in order to to kind of help people with pain or whatever. They were they had particular prominence in society, and the kind of witch hunts basically diminished that kind of power by targeting those women who had that kind of respect in the community. And one of the kind of important points is the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, which is this really important book written by a guy called Institorius, who was a misogynistic monk who basically he was made.
I wondered what you were going to say after misogynistic. I thought you were going to say him.
Well, there's some other words I like to use, but
he's another single syllable word.
Yes, not too different to monk. So he basically mainly wrote this book called the Malleus Maleficarum, which was published first in 1486, which basically it challenged the existing view of witchcraft at the time, which was that witchcraft didn't work, and he basically said it does work, and it works because witches are working with the devil, and so through this book he was able to kind of offer some very specific but completely erroneous guidance on how you identify witches. Why women in particular were kind of vulnerable to corruption by the devil, and then how you try them and execute them. Yeah, which is, there's someone we were before we started recording, Sally, you were sharing some really lovely quotations from said book. I don't know if you still got.
I have. I've still got the book open because I can't stop looking at it. So before I read that quote again, I just want to hop like maybe half a page back. So because you mentioned the Maleficarum could tell a witch hunter how to identify a witch.
Yeah.
And apparently a telling sign was the presence of an extra nipple somewhere on the body.
Yeah.
That was apparently used by witches to suckle their familiars, or even the devil himself, because he's into that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then, so let's get down to this quote. So it says, so basically the reasons all relate to the classic and phallocentric definition of woman as the other and the weaker and sort of dangerous complement of man. And the direct quote from the Maleficarum is, "What else is woman but a foe to friendship, an unescapable punishment, a necessary evil, a natural temptation, a desirable calamity, a domestic danger," that's my favourite, "a delectable detriment, an evil of nature, and painted with fair colours." And, it's like they're talking about me. It's uncanny. Absolutely
well,
uncanny.
I think you and I would both be in trouble if...
Oh, we'd be knackered, mate.
Yeah.
Absolutely knackered.
Absolutely. So it's full of this we can look at it with modern eyes and go, this is clearly just misogynistic, hate-filled.
Get your bleep ready, Dan.
Fact,
it's misogynistic bullshit.
Yes. In fact, it's probably not too dissimilar to the kind of stuff that you might find on some, kind of red pill incel websites.
Incel sites, yeah. Oh my god.
Yeah. So basically, but go on.
Sorry, Kirsty. I was just going to say, I kind of. I haven't read the book, so if I'm getting the wrong idea, please say. But it seems to cloak its argument that witchcraft is dangerous, and we need to get rid of witchcraft.
Yeah.
By basically saying, but women are dangerous anyway.
Yeah.
And that don't, they're already bad, even if they weren't witches. So basically, even if I was talking nonsense, it would still be good to listen to me.
Yeah.
There's a circular...
And absolutely, yeah. And it's patriarchal, isn't it? It kind of diminishes the power of women, the standing of women within a community, and it punishes women who, kind of dare to stand up and to speak out and to, kind of do what they thought was right. So... Yeah, it talks about women that they're more likely to succumb to this kind of pact with the devil because of their carnal desires. So that idea of female sexuality, or more driven by kind of the need for sex, that they talk more and so therefore more likely to accidentally say stuff they shouldn't, and so therefore need spells in order to keep people quiet. Yeah, okay. And also...
can I interrupt you there, Kirsty?
How dare you?
This is my favourite bit from your notes.
Yes. That they're more prone to fever.
Carnal desires, willingness to spill secrets, and that they are prone to fever.
Yeah. So the idea is, I think that it's actually they're more prone to dysentery. So therefore more likely to be feverish, and so in their kind of state of fever more likely to kind of sign a pact with the devil and do his dark bidding. Not for tables though. So it's what's interesting about it is that it doesn't the mythology of the Maleficarum doesn't actually empower women. at all. It just says, that women are more likely to serve Satan than, not. But what's really interesting, though, is that it wasn't that this idea of kind of the woman as a witch isn't culturally universal. So in Iceland, for example, the kind of purge they had there was more male focused, because actually their pagan tradition, because obviously Iceland is kind of very rich in terms of its kind of pagan culture and pagan history, actually was already quite patriarchal in those structures, and so men were the kind of magical practitioners more than women were. So their purge, they're overwhelmingly the victims were male, not female. That's kind of so all of that stuff.
Were they also influenced by the same text?
Yes.
Or would they have,
Yeah, but they
So they would read that book and think this stuff applies to men. It seems quite unlikely because of the circular logic that I alluded to, that you could read this, because basically this book seems like it says women are horrible in all ways, aren't they? And P.S. they're also witches.
Yeah.
And it seems like a kind of patriarchal witch society would look at that book and just go, "Oh, this book just hates women. That's all right. We've got them sorted out anyway."
But I think what happened though with is that the use of the word witch, is more commonly used in the book than woman. But there's a kind of there's sort of three parts of the book. One is explains kind of what a witch is, and then how to do the process of identifying them, capturing them, and torturing them, and then executing them. But what's interesting with Iceland is just because, unlike the rest of Europe, where women had were the midwives and were the kind of not that the societies were entirely matriarchal, but there was more status for women. The idea of the wise woman, for example, that wasn't the same. The structures weren't the same in Iceland, so they were able to, to be fair, I think Iceland didn't have a massive amount of death. It was not huge, but they were men, and it was that the connection has been made to the fact that their kind of pagan tradition was more patriarchal anyway. So, but I think often what happened with it's not that the result of the Malleus Maleficarum wasn't that genuine witches were being identified and tortured and executed. It was just a way. I mean, it was a really easy way of getting rid of people who weren't conforming or who pissed you off in any way. So
just
it was
standardised persecution of women.
And actually, I think it was a thing in the Maleficarum which basically sort of it kind of encouraged people to that you had a duty to report anything that looked like witchcraft, and that actually if you didn't, then that was as bad as being a witch. Right. So it was probably better, if you wanted to not burn on a hellishly hot pyre, to accuse somebody of witchcraft than to wait for somebody to accuse you.
Right.
So So all of these ideas, basically, if you think about it, are kind of, I mean, this was a massively popular book, even though that it wasn't, the church and academia pretty quickly distanced themselves from it. But it was really, really, really popular with people in Europe and then in America. It was actually it was the only other book that outsold it was the Bible.
Wow.
Okay.
So those ideas and those, kind of the idea that witchcraft works and that witches are women and are in league with the devil, that underpins, I think, all of these, kind of the way in which witches have been represented in, more contemporary media texts. So one of the first films about witchcraft is a film called Haxan, Witchcraft of the Ages, made in 1922, which purports to be a documentary. But it's a documentary of the Malleus Maleficarum, which, is bullshit anyway. So, so it kind of looked at that, and then the hysteria surrounding witch hunts. And whilst it sort of starts off as being kind of quite documentary-like, it becomes much more kind of poetic and much more, kind of creative in its treatment of reality. And that's 1922. So, already we've got a very strong link between the Malleus Maleficarum, the published book, from way back when, which nobody should really take seriously, and, one of the first representations of witches in horror, in cinema.
So, in a way, I haven't seen Haxan. Is it more like a dramatisation of the book? Do you know what I mean?
I haven't seen it in a very long time, but yes, it has those kind of elements of, it sets out to use that kind of documentary kind of form. But, in 1922, like what a documentary was and how it operated is still very much kind of up for grabs. There wasn't, there isn't a kind of, a documentary set of codes and conventions that everybody used, but so it kind of termed itself a documentary. But it has representations of the actual devil in it. So,
right, okay.
Yeah. And then the next one to talk about is the Wizard of Oz, I think,
okay.
Which is obviously not horror, but I think if you see it as a small child, there are parts of it which are
very frightening.
very, very frightening. The flying monkeys, not least,
and the wheelies in Return to Oz.
Oh gosh!
No.
Return to Oz, a full stop, is just horror as far as I'm concerned.
Well, to be fair, when they made Return to Oz, obviously realised, look, the Wizard of Oz has already traumatised all the children in the world. We need to make sure this film goes even further, and they actually succeeded in that.
Yeah.
I think the Wizard of Oz, when I was reading your notes, it made me think about how witches as a monster sort of frequently appearing outside horror.
Yes.
Because while the Wizard of Oz, it's the musical and stuff. Then later on, you've got things like Bewitched and Sabrina and even Roald Dahl's book, the witches. You've got witches appearing, a monster that's sort of stepping out of horror and sometimes being quite sympathetic, so particularly with Sabrina. And then with the Wizard of Oz, when I studied witches on my horror module many years ago, we looked at it in terms of the Wicked Witch of the North, is it? I can't remember.
West.
The good and the bad witch.
It's the Good Witch of the North, and the Wicked Witch is the one from the West, I think. By the way, this is an exact conversation from the Blair Witch Project. And she says Wicked Witch of the East was the bad one. No wonder they got lost in the woods.
Well, it's all right. I'm just sat in a bedroom in my house, so I'm fine. Not going to get lost. Maybe, but the exploration of the good and the perceived good and the perceived bad elements of femininity. So the Good Witch arrives in her nice pink bubble and a big pink dress and a lovely blonde hair, and she's perfectly made up and she wants to help Dorothy and she's all lovely. Then you've got the Wicked Witch who's you've bent over and cackly and mean and nasty, and she hates children, and it's that dichotomy between a woman should be lovely and friendly and nice and want to help children and like children, or you've got the woman who hates children, so she's obviously evil, obviously a witch, you're a bad person, everything that's wrong with femininity over there in the Wicked Witch. And when I was young and I watched it, I didn't see any of that. I just saw the terrifying flying monkeys. But looking back at it now, older with fresher eyes, and old eyes as well, let's be honest, you can see how entrenched these ideas of women were, as you just said yourself, in very, very early cinema. It's right there.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting about The Wizard of Oz, on one hand, it's from a kind of pagan representation, is actually not terrible, because there is a distinction between, kind of two different types of witches, rather than all witches are terrible. But then kind of Glinda isn't, that the idea that she is a witch is sort of slightly underplayed only in as much as she's an unusual representation. Whereas obviously, not that she's called Elphaba, but let's call her that. That the kind of Wicked Witch of the East is much more clearly an archetypical or archetypal witch, and that links to something that Barbara Creed talks about in her book Monstrous Feminine, talks about the idea of the phallic woman, the ugly witch, the ugly witch, but particularly in the phallic woman, with the emphasis on, things that are clearly more phallic. So her, kind of pointy nose and pointy fingers. Yeah. And the fact that she doesn't, she's not a queen or a consort to a male with more power. She's more threatening because of that lack of, a kind of patriarchal figure within her sphere. And, so that's, the kind of Freudian reading is that she's an emasculating character because she has no need of a man in order to kind of fully kind of self-actualize and do what she wants, so
and therefore evil,
exactly. Yeah. It's like women, when freed from the kind of patriarchal structures, are just much more threatening.
Right. Well, I'm certainly frightened. I don't know about the listeners, so this seems a good point to ask, because we're talking about the Wizard of Oz and the good and the wicked witches. I've always wondered about the phrase, the white witch. Is that something which has any basis in any tradition, or is it just a synonym for good that people use generically when defining witches as good or evil?
I think the meaning is different depending on who you ask. I think it was a fashionable term at one point to very clearly, if you're going to identify yourself as a witch to other people, to sort of say, no, I'm a good witch. Don't worry about me. I think that there are, kind of part of at least my understanding and my kind of reconciliation with what my witch identity means to me is that there's kind of light and dark in all of us, and that in part of to understand ourselves is to embrace our our kind of light side and our dark side, our light and shadow. So I think in a more contemporary sense it's not used as much because people I think are a little bit more cool with the idea of we are a whole, and sometimes that's light and sometimes that's dark, and the darkness doesn't necessarily mean that we're hexing and cursing, left, right and centre. It just means sometimes a little bit more kind of sitting with, the things that are, sort of darker expressions of ourselves.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
In Barbara Creed's book, The Monstrous Feminine, which I've just talked about, she also makes the point about how the kind of the archetype of the witch in horror is something that's distinctly female because of kind of female reproduction, that women and female experience is just kind of closer to or more commonly linked to abjection, and she makes a kind of interesting point which many other people have made, which is that kind of back in before we knew and understood things, that females kind of often seemed to men to be magical because we could just suddenly there was a baby, and that kind of understanding of the relationship between having sex and producing a child, that wasn't something that we initially understood. And also then the kind of menstrual cycle is the same length as a lunar cycle, and all of those kind of things. So and to go back to that kind of the way that women often were, kind of positioned within kind of rural and early societies as being, kind of the caregivers, the, kind of the midwives, looking after other women in particular, often meant that those, kind of female structures, female communities were kind of insular within a wider society, a wider community. So that's something that Creed sort of draws on in thinking about why women are often, viewed as other in horror, but in really specifically female ways. And And then I read a really interesting book called Metaphysical Media by Emily D. Edwards. And in that book, she's got a whole chapter which talks about the different types of witch archetypes in film and media more broadly. So I just thought it's quite useful to just kind of go through those, because actually I was surprised after, sitting there kind of and as a witch going, I'm annoyed that all witches are represented the same. And then I read that chapter and I was so wrong. So she identifies 8 different archetypes of witches on screen. So I'll just run through them quickly with a couple of examples. So she talks about the satanic witch. So this is a, kind of a witch that is exclusively linked to the kind of devil, or motivated by the devil or Satan or whatever. So blood on Satan's claw, for example, is quite a good example of that type of witch. She talks about the historical witch. So obviously these are, these are representations of witches that are based in historical record. So, any depiction of the Joan of Arc story, for example. Haxan obviously has elements of this, and Witchfinder General also kind of depicts historical witches. Whether or not they're actually witches is obviously up for debate, but it's, rooted in, the kind of witch purge and the witch trials. Then she talks about the dubious witch, which is, kind of essentially a fake witch. So a woman who is often accused of being a witch, but not, righteously. So there's an example of that kind of character in The Seventh Seal. The Crucible is another one. So witches who aren't witches, essentially. Then she talks about, of course, fairy tale witches. So good examples of those, obviously slightly more kind of family friendly. So, characters like Maleficent or Starless. And we might even think about, to a certain extent, Frozen. Elsa is, labelled as a witch early on when her powers are revealed. But then, she's still a witch. She still has, the kind of witchly powers, and also does not need a man. Well done, Disney.
Would you put Ophelia from Pan's Labyrinth in that section? Because she's kind of going on a journey of discovering that she can cast spells and manipulate things.
Yeah, I think she might actually better fit into a later category, which I'll skip to now, which is the ingenue. Right. So this is, kind of often, it's whenever the witch archetype is framed alongside a coming of age narrative.
Right, okay.
So when they're coming into their power. So, yes, but also kind of Carrie is, that kind of narrative. And even, kind of Harry Potter. Harry himself,
right.
Even though it's a world that differentiates between, kind of male practitioners and female practitioners, that, come on guys, they're all the same. JK ought to know better. But she clearly doesn't, but there you go.
Wizardry.
Yes, exactly. Because the only and I think there was, so just to go back, I'm not entirely 100% certain about when this happened, but there was a point in Europe where witchcraft was illegal and you could be burnt at the stake, but sorcery, that was fine.
Oh, that was all good, was it?
Guess what the difference was?
A penis.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. You had to have, that was. You had to own a penis. So, I'm sure there were many witches who were getting themselves penises in order to...
Well, that was a question that did occur to me earlier, actually. In a 300-year period, if you're burning all the women who were basically the apothecaries and the healers...
Yeah.
What happened? I mean, presumably those communities continue to need people like that, and I know that a lot of them will have gone underground and just kind of hidden their abilities. But if you were a male and you started to dabble in that area, was that just overlooked?
Well, or that you were just sort of, you were able to frame it in a slightly different way, as I'm an alchemist, or I'm a, I'm a scholar, and
right.
Right. So that was shit. Generally that they could kind of continue, but it was about how it was kind of framed and how it was recorded, and there's quite a lot of stuff around the Knights Templar, for example, about their practices, which are slightly more pagan than we might have expected.
Okay.
So, just going to go back to the taxonomy then. We've got the shamanic witch. So these are often representations of a little bit more kind of culturally sensitive in terms of that they tend to be, this is more we might find are representations of kind of voodoo, hoodoo practitioners. So I've got Eve's Bayou as an example, but also the Naomi Harris characters. What's her name? Tia, somebody from Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End. Kind of.
I haven't seen either of those films, so.
But it's much more kind of like, for want of a better term, kind of ethnic witchcraft that, kind of comes from, has roots in, kind of in more tribal, kind of, sub-Saharan,
non-European cultures by the sound of it.
Thanks for that. Struggling there.
Okay.
It's like, so that's that type, but that's not, again, but it's a slightly false thing, because that idea is that I would argue that next week when we talk about Midsummer, that there's an element of that kind of cultural specificity that is present in Midsummer, and arguably in Wicker Man, which is which is shamanic at least in that definition. Then we've got New Age, which is a little bit more kind of wishy-washy. And so the example that Edwards gives is San from Farscape, who I don't know if you either of you remember Farscape, but she was the blue lady.
I remember Farscape.
Yes, and she was very much kind of in touch with energies. And then the other example I found was a kind of a low budget American rom-com called 10-Inch Hero, which is about a girl who moves to California and moves in with somebody who sort of practices Wicca, but in a kind of in a very kind of new agey, very light crystals, kind of,
right,
bohemian styling type thing. So that kind of representation. Then we talked about the ingenue, and then finally there's the enchantress. So this is the kind of version of the witch who uses feminine sexuality to lure kind of male victims. So Love Witch, which hopefully we'll talk about a bit more later, and Practical Magic, which I know is not a horror film, but is one that the people who identify with witches often sort of cite as being quite an important film in terms of the representation of witchcraft on screen. So those are those types, which kind of leads us into I think talking about the witch. So Robert Eggers' 2015 film. So I think the contextual thing to know about this is that which gets revealed, and there's part of me that wishes that it had been at the beginning rather than at the end, is the acknowledgement that it's really, really strongly based on sort of witch trials, or kind of the witch purge that happened in America, and was that a lot of the dialogue was based on historical documentation from the time. So it clearly is, in terms of Edwards' taxonomy, this is the satanic witch.
The satanic witch is my favourite kind of witch. I just want to put that out there.
Right. It clearly fits into a Christian worldview.
Yes. Absolutely. And the just for context, the story is about a Puritan family that they get kicked out of their town for being too Puritan, and then they go off into the woods, into the middle of nowhere, and trying to sort of carve out a life for themselves. And it all kicks off when they're beautiful. And then this is the thing and when you're watching horror, you always know it's terrible. When they have this beautiful little baby Samuel who gets taken, and then is no more. And that kind of starts kind of kicks off the horror in the narrative. So
and this is in 1700s New England.
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah,
So,
1630s apparently.
1630s, yeah.
So this is 60 years before the
sorry,
Salem.
17th century. I meant to say.
Yeah, 60 years before the Salem witch trials, which happened, 1690s. So last week when we talked about it, Dan, there was as far as I remember, a kind of intake of breath when we talked about this film. So I'm really keen to know what you feel about it.
Well, I mean, I've seen it twice now.
Yeah.
And I watched it once when it was new, and had quite a bad experience with it, in the sense that I watched it with a bunch of guys and we essentially just laughed at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't really think it had much merit, to be honest. Yeah. But I did very quickly become aware that it has been received very, very well in almost all critical quarters, and with a great section of the horror community. And reading more about it, I thought, intellectually, I see what they're saying. I get this. So therefore, I've long been intending to watch it again to try and get a second refreshed view on it. And the fact that we're talking about this now gave me that opportunity. I suppose my intake of breath was slight disappointment, not in the film, but because I didn't feel that I got that much more out of it. The conclusion that I came to was that it's a hugely admirable film, brilliant in so many ways. It just doesn't emotionally affect me very much, and I think that might significantly be due to the fact that my initial viewing of it was in that way. If I'd watched it on my own with different preconceptions, then I could have a different emotional memory about it. But unfortunately, watching it again, it's quite a simple story. So even though it was several years since I've seen it, I still pretty much knew everything that was going to happen. So let me say some good things about it. I don't think they necessarily connect to the topic of the discussion, but it's a brilliantly written film. The use of language is amazing.
Yeah.
I think it's so admirable because it was done on such a small budget. The acting is fantastic in parts. Particularly the children in it are amazing. I think a main problem I have with engaging with the story is that I don't really like the performance of Ralph Ineson, who plays the father.
Yeah.
And also Anya Taylor-Joy, who plays the oldest child.
Thomasin,
yeah. She's brilliant, but just somehow doesn't look right to me. I think that was my problem, because I came away with it for the first time definitely thinking she wasn't very good. Now I look at it and see that she's giving a kind of incredibly well-tooled, perfectly pitched performance. But I think there's something about the way she's kind of looks cherubic and
she doesn't
just healthy.
She doesn't look dirty enough, does she? That's what in the they're in this kind of this hovel in the middle of the woods, and that they should all be a lot grubbier. And I think I think it partly is to do with the the kind of her her beautiful porcelain skin and her beautifully bright blonde hair.
Yeah.
I mean, she doesn't quite fit in that landscape in a convincing way.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree. I think
glad
she's,
you said that, because I wondered if I was being unfair on her by feeling like that, because the children, the younger children, are also, very cute and healthy looking.
Yeah.
Because whereas the parents are extremely haggard, they're not that old, but it's a hard life they're all living.
Yeah.
And I suppose I kind of thought that it's all right when you're very young to have that bloom and and that chubby brightness to you, but as you get older, that you'd lose that.
Yeah.
And I thought Thomasin was just slightly too old to not have lost that. Or do you know what I mean? And Yeah, so therefore, in a way, I found it difficult. I think it's really essential if you're getting into the story to feel sympathy for Thomasin and to feel sometimes sympathy and sometimes afraid of the father. And I think if you don't feel those things, it's hard to get into it. So intellectually, and the way the story goes, I have complete sympathy for Thomasin. But in terms of her being on screen, I'm not really moved by it. But there are so many things in the film that I think it does just very effectively. I think the scene at the start where the baby is kidnapped, where Thomasin is playing peekaboo with it, and then she opens her eyes and the baby's just gone, is so chilling.
Yeah.
And the movie is full of brilliantly pitched kind of details like that. And I also really appreciate, as you're giving me the floor in terms of unloading my impressions of this movie, bless you, I kind of like, I think the film does a very successful balance between the kind of witchcraft, black magic kind of aspects of the plot being frightening. I think the witch herself, the initial witch who takes the child, is filmed really strongly in the sense that you see her, but not too much.
Yeah.
Other familiar characters in the movie, like Black Phillip, have an atmosphere around them. The children and their different reactions, and there's especially the scene where the older boy is kind of possessed. That's, it's very harrowing. And it has all that, but at the same time, ultimately at the end, and, I did say that we're going to spoil this, but when Thomasin kind of chooses to become a witch at the end, you do feel that, the film does align that with Satan and things that, but you do feel that that's the best deal available to her.
Yeah.
And, given what she's come from, 45 minutes earlier in the film, I think her mum and dad were talking about, because their crops had failed and they had no money, they were talking about taking her back to the settlement and marrying her off.
Yeah.
Or selling her into servitude. I think
getting her
is
to sort of work for the family, isn't it?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, just using her as a source of income, and compared to all that, I think the choice she makes is really understandable, and also the ending where there's a kind of a coven of witches who all start to fly. It's just brilliantly done, and again, I marvel at it from the sense of considering the budget of the film. Because I think that ending, which I loved even the first time I watched it, even though I didn't like the rest of the film, I thought that was a really well-realised ending. It's just kind of Thomasin flying up into the darkness and laughing. I just thought was fantastic. So those are most of my thoughts on it, Kirsty. I'm sure I'll have more, but... So, how about yourself?
Well, I was going to ask Stella what she thought.
Okay, Stella.
Well, I think lots of the things that Dan said I agree with. I think the historical detail in the film had me swinging from either really appreciating it and thinking they'd done very, very well, particularly with the construction of the dialogue. But there were times when I found the construction of the dialogue in its sort of historical, manner of speaking and the vernacular and all that sort of stuff, I found it a bit annoying sometimes. Maybe it was just the way Ralph Ineson was delivering it. And I don't know, with that actor, anyway, I always just want him to clear his throat. It just right. The whole time I'm sat there going, so that kind of clouds my judgment a little bit. However, the film as a whole, I thought, as a sort of slow build tension, it was really, really good. And all the looks back into the forest behind them, I really enjoy. Who doesn't enjoy a spooky forest, really? Yeah. And then I think, like you said at the end, when she rises up into the trees and she's, you know, laughing away at having become a witch, I was like you said, yeah, you go and become a witch. That's definitely what you should do after everything that you've been through. So I found the ending to be a pleasing ending because that's what I wanted her to do. And I think the most harrowing bit in the film for me was when Caleb offers Samuel to the mother, what's she called? Catherine.
Yeah.
So that she might breastfeed the baby, but then the baby turns out to be a crow that's pecking at her breast.
Yeah.
Oh,
and
yeah,
that bit was like,
stunning.
having breastfed a child myself, it was like, ugh.
Yeah.
So that was the bit that made me go, oh dear. Oh no. But
No.
I did enjoy the film, but yeah, sometimes I struggled with the construction of the dialogue in that way sometimes. But I was overall pleased with Thomasin joining the coven and becoming a witch.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just got to say, I don't think you need to be a mother or anything to feel
No.
that scene is horrible.
Nobody wants a crow
And I
pecking at
think-
your boob.
Nope.
Although, having said that, maybe if it was Ralph Ineson getting his nipple pecked, I wouldn't have been as bothered. I do think Kate Dickie is fantastic as well.
Yeah.
She again,
and-
Kate Dickie. We shall never forget her name, like ever again, Dan.
No, never again.
Never again.
She's fantastic. And also, I don't think I mentioned, I just think it's beautifully shot.
It is.
And the music is amazing. I think maybe, again, because it's extremely sinister, kind of atonal, beautifully crafted music, I think if you're sitting there not finding the film frightening and the music is kind of going at saying to you, you must be scared, which it sort of is, I think that could be a bit annoying, and that might have also set me against it first time, but it is a brilliant score.
Yeah.
So
I think for, you know, if anyone who's not seen it, I think if, you know, you do like sort of anything in and around witches, freaky babies, weird children, it's definitely up there and worth watching.
Yeah.
You know, if that's your particular box of frogs. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good one, I think. I think, you know, there's definitely worse rather witch movies.
Yeah.
For sure.
Oh, and can I say, and the voice of Black Phillip when he finally speaks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the voice,
Yes.
and I also love that you don't see him speak, obviously, because he's a goat,
Yes.
and it would be very difficult to not make that comedic.
Yeah.
Although on the second viewing, I couldn't really tell if it was meant to be him speaking. You know, because you see that figure who's just kind of supposed to be Satan, but you don't see him speaking either, but the voice comes from somewhere.
Yeah.
But there's just something so chilling about the way that voice is delivered.
Yeah.
Things like that I did love very much. So, Kirsty, give us your thoughts,
Well,
please.
I mean, I have a variety of thoughts. I think mine, as a horror fan, and as somebody who really likes a really slow burn, I thought it was great. I thought it was really well crafted, and some of those, like the final kind of few shots with the kind of coven and Thomasin, kind of elevating in with the trees behind her reminded me, and I apologise I don't have the specific name of the artist, but there's that kind of very romantic kind of image of kind of ethereal or set of art by, I think, Victorian painters of kind of ethereal women, kind of against night skies.
Sort of
yeah,
pre-Raphaelite stuff.
I'm not sure if it's pre-Raphaelite specifically, but that it reminded me of that, and yes, as a witch though. It pisses me off no end.
Okay.
No, just purely because, again, I mean, it's not to say that there are not satanic witches. There are, but kind of being a pagan witch means that you're completely divorced from the kind of Christian theology. Usually,
Sure.
Again, I'm sure there are some witches who would identify themselves as Christian witches, which is fine, and but. It's that sort of sense of, I mean, because of what this film is and what it sets out to do, it couldn't be any other way because of, its historical reference point and its, and the use of that dialogue and its the source material and all of that kind of stuff. But we still kind of end up in a place where you talked about the initial witch. Well, she's naked and she's old, and so we have that again. What is often used, and again, I'm going to repeat the same criticism with Midsummer, is that the older female naked body is part of the aesthetic of horror. Often it's meant to be sort of seen as abject and horrible and there, rather than something beautiful and empowering or whatever. So aligning her with sacrificing a baby, which thank you Robert Eggers for not actually putting that on screen. Thank you for hiding that in the cut. I'm very, very grateful. But still, we have that kind of sense of the evilness.
It's pretty unambiguous.
It is, absolutely.
They do everything but show it.
So we have the idea of witches, human sacrifices, older women, kind of as part of the, kind of abject aesthetic. The use of, I love Black Phillip. He's clearly an icon already, I think. But it's the use of, kind of a horned animal, which stands in for Satan. So that has, a kind of association with pagan tradition, which is being, again, co-opted in the way in which it always has and coded, therefore, as evil. And again, there's the bit in the middle of the film where Caleb is, kind of off in the forest by himself, and he, understandably, kind of sees this beautiful woman and is, kind of lured in by her. But again, the film is equating female sexuality as something that's intrinsically linked to witchcraft, which is, kind of what Edward's talked about in that enchantress archetype. And so we have that sort of sense that it's not how she really looks. It's like the Red Woman in Game of Thrones, isn't it? That's not how she really looks. This is a facade in order to get, what she wants from him. I did like, though, the way that the film sort of sets up this idea that the witch can only be female, or witches can only be female, and then does this lovely turn when we realise actually what's been going on with Black Phillip and actually who has been in league with him, which are the twins. So we have this, kind of male, this idea that whilst, kind of Thomasin gets in trouble because she, jokes with her sister about, oh, I'm the witch and I'm going to eat you, that actually it's, it's not quite as kind of clear cut as that. But I think the tragedy of the film, not in a critical sense, but the what drives the film in terms of it being horror and you feeling invested in it, is that what we have is a good, I'm doing air quotes, and Christian family. That there's nothing particularly evil about them. They want to survive. They seem to love each other. They seem to just be trying to kind of get through this horrible things that happen to them. And so they're all sort of victims of Black Phillip and his witches, which as a viewer rather puts you on the side of, I felt, on the side of the family rather than Black Phillip. And I get what you're both saying about kind of feeling like it's the right ending for Thomasin, but it's an obvious ending that she, as a young influential girl, becomes a witch, becomes seduced by it. That's exactly what the Myers Malvocarum said would happen, rather than kind of going, screw you guys, I'm gonna get this axe and chop your head off, Black Phillip, bathe in your blood, and then I'm going to go back into town and they might burn me as a witch, but at least I'll know that I did the right thing. So
that'd be lovely ending.
It would, wouldn't it? So it sort of slightly does, again, reinforce those images that came from the Malvocarum, of kind of women as being secondary, and often willing followers of kind of demonic male. So
true. I'll just respond to a couple of points, though. I found that I didn't, well, the family is largely innocent. The children certainly seem to be, and I think the mother is, but I think that they're all victims of the father, and I don't think I just didn't like him because I don't really like Ralph Ineson. I think that he's meant to be, well, they're thrown out of their settlement for being too Puritan.
Yeah, which is
he's very hard line Christian, isn't he? I I think maybe the film doesn't give us enough material about exactly the conflict of beliefs between him and the settlement.
Yeah, I think that would have been helpful.
An informed judgment.
I think that would have been helpful, and I think certainly depicting him as being slightly more hardline, particularly around maybe his treatment of Thomas and Caleb would have been better. I'm going to be honest. I don't find Ralph Ineson as objectionable as you both clearly do. Right. I thought I quite enjoyed him in this.
Well, that's cool. I think maybe I'm unfair on him, and he's become, as a result of this film, he's become a bit of a star in the folk horror area. Whereas before this film, he was best known for playing Finchy in The Office. It's a nice move for him. But I was just sitting there thinking, gosh, this would be so much better if he was Christopher Eccleston. Yeah. Or something like that.
But again, I think that's the writing, though, isn't it? In that it would... because the scenes that we get to see him in, or that emphasise him, so there's a whole bit, isn't there, where it's just him and Caleb in the woods, and he seems to be kind of quite a reasonable man, in terms of him wanting to kind of keep his family going, and he's obviously explains about the selling of the cup, and and
he's trying to teach his son things.
Yeah,
I think I read it that he's basically misguided, but he is sincerely doing his best. I suppose that's so. He is a positive character in that sense. He's well-meaning. Yeah. He's just kind of too harsh and not very good at doing all the things he wants to do.
No.
Which is why I kind of say that the turning to witchcraft at the end is like the best option available to Thomasin. It's not... Yeah. I mean, the ending that you suggest, which is that she kind of asserts her own agency and goes back to the settlement... would be lovely, but at the same time, it's not a great option for her.
No,
because she'd get burned or whatever. Well, so just kind of pragmatically, I think you as a viewer, I kind of felt just a little bit glad that she was getting something a bit better. I'm not saying it's perfect.
No. Well, but it, I mean, she certainly is seduced into what's the phrase he uses about into living deliciously, and who doesn't want to live deliciously, to be honest. But my deliciousness, my preferred deliciousness at the end of the film would have been a goat roast. I think there's a big fire there already.
I'm vegan, so I don't want that.
See, I'm not even into eating goat, but I just feel like that, that would...
Though, mind you, a good goat curry.
Indeed.
That sounds like a brilliant episode of How It Should Have Ended. Yes. The witch, would you like to live deliciously? She goes, yes, and chops his head off. Puts him on the spit.
Absolutely. So, yeah. So should we talk about a couple of the other? I mean, the other two films that I picked out to talk about witches are ones that we've covered in previous episodes, so that we're kind of fairly familiar with them. So,
sure.
Firstly, I wanted to go back to the Love Witch, which is a very, very different representation of witchcraft, and arguably a much more kind of contemporary one. This is Anna Biller, written, directed, edited, conceived, birthed by Anna Biller in 2016. And I think what's interesting about this is that, the character of Elaine, she's not, kind of morally righteous, is she? Bless her. But she but she does seem to kind of have a sort of kind of an agency of her own, and I think for me, the way that this provides a slightly more contemporary and clearly more anachronistic and less historical representation of witchcraft is that it taps into more the idea of kind of witches aesthetic. So if you if anybody feels like they need to kind of sort of see how witchcraft has manifested itself in social media spaces, can I suggest you look at the tag Witches of Instagram on Instagram.
I've seen that.
Yeah. So this is, and I am not in any way doubting this kind of spiritual practice or identity of any of these very, very lovely, well-crafted looking females on Instagram, but kind of witch goth bohemian, it's become this kind of aesthetic in some
very
ways.
Stylized, isn't
yes, it? Yeah. And they look, I'm gonna be honest, they look amazing.
Yeah.
I'm very jealous of a lot of them.
I know, I'm the same as that. I had a flat stomach like that once too.
But it does sort of the Love Witch, I think, sort of speaks to that way in which the aesthetic becomes a kind of manifestation of female empowerment. Particularly in those spaces. Sure. But the flip side of that is the way in which kind of the images of the kind of enchantress witch, which Elaine clearly is in that film. It conforms still to the kind of the idea of the male gaze, and the male gaze is not something that doesn't exist in pagan spaces, because it fucking does. So there are, kind of, kind of Gerald Gardner, kind of as one of the kind of fathers of Wicca. I'm not sure if he promoted it himself, but it certainly happened. Is the idea of kind of performing rituals. It's called Skyclad. That's what it's called in the biz, which essentially is performing stuff naked, and you can find lots of pictures of rituals happening with kind of skyclad people, and they are very kind of Elaine looking, very svelte, very pert women. Which she did very, very much is, and there's a whole bit in that film, isn't there, which is we have the kind of the priest who seems to be, I think, Dan, we talked about him being a bit like Simon Cowell, sort of in charge of all these young women. So there's that kind of thing going.
And the multiple scenes in the film where they're all sitting around naked. So I mean, whilst it's clearly not unproblematic in a range of ways, that film does offer, a slightly different version of witchcraft and kind of witch identity than we normally get in horror generally, where witches are satanic or they're powerful, they're kind of entirely abject or aberrant. Kind of creatures. This offers something slightly different. Well, I think the Love Witch kind of normalises it, doesn't it? Not in the sense that the witches are kind of normal in the wider world of the film, because the characters in the film who are detectives or whatever obviously aren't part of the paganism community. But when you meet characters in the film who are witches, Elaine's friends or whatever, they just talk and act like normal people. They go out for drinks, and they might be naked, but when they do certain things or whatever, but there's a very down to earth quality to the way it shows it. And they're not characterized particularly as villains.
No,
or anything
and
like
and it is worth saying that what makes Elaine an interesting character in that world is that she is doing this extreme stuff. She is using her magic to essentially it's not always magic, but the men die because of her, but that we don't get the sense of that's what happens in that's what witches do. It isn't. That's just what Elaine is doing. Which is, I think, is a really important distinction. And the other ones I want to talk about is the two versions of Suspiria, which obviously the Argento one kind of frames very much the idea of that I've forgotten what her name is now. The kind of the leader of the academy is a witch, and they're all witches, and but it's.
Do you mean?
I forgot what her name is.
I'm looking back.
You mean Helena Marcos?
Yes.
Or do you mean?
Yes, Mother Marcos. Yes.
So the kind of head of the coven. You don't see until the end.
No. who of course is Tilda Swinton, isn't she? In the new one, and that's kind of interesting from a witch perspective. And I think I'm not sure does the new one even use that term witch. I'm not sure it does, or at least if it does, it doesn't use it as quite as pointed a way.
I don't remember it.
Unless it could be. We might have Chloe Grace Moretz at the beginning raving about.
I think he probably does.
Yeah.
Because, or at least, I think the Chloe Moretz character.
Yeah.
You know, when she goes to Joseph at the beginning for help, she does say something like, you know, they're all witches in this school that I've gone to.
Yeah.
So,
or at least it doesn't seem as quite as strongly stated, does it?
It's not recurrent through the film, and also she's not really an objective character.
No, she's mad. So.
Yeah. So the audience doesn't receive it in the same way. Whereas I think in the original Suspiria, it's like a slow process of investigation by the two lead women.
Yes, and then we get the knowledge of the idea of witchcraft is legitimised, isn't it, by the Udo Kier.
Oh, some male characters.
The historians. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So that seems much more kind of clearly stated. But what's interesting with both those films is that they're both about kind of female communities that are almost exclusively, not less so in the original, obviously, but more so in the 2018 version, are more about female community and female power structures.
Yeah.
But both, I think, whilst they might place an emphasis on the identity of the women as witches, we don't. With the exception of the ending of the newer version, we don't see ritual in the same way as we might expect to see it in other films about witchcraft. And there isn't any reference to Satan or, you know, that it has a very distinct mythology that seems more pagan and more shadowy than it is kind of framed within a kind of Judeo-Christian kind of set of mythology, which is, of course, what the witch does.
Right.
Yeah. The remake of Suspiria is particularly strong in characterising that community.
Yeah.
I think one of my problems with it was I couldn't quite follow some of the structures within the coven about, you know, like how they all vote for different leaders and things like that. But, you know, you at least do get the sense that it's quite a complex relationship within the group. And also the relationship between the women who run the academy, who are the Coven of Witches, and the young women who are the dance students, some of whom become witches. But, you know, they all kind of associate together. You've got that really nice scene where they all go out for a meal together.
Yeah.
And that's kind of juxtaposed with the, you know, scenes where the witch women they hypnotise and make fun of the two male detectives who at one point come investigating. So, you know, you do get a lot of different. It's kind of clear in the film that these women are able to operate on lots of different modes, and interact with each other in complex ways.
Yeah, complex is a good word, I think. And whilst, you know, that neither version of Suspiria offers a representation of witchcraft that I recognise as being inside the, you know, kind of my own personal experience with it. Nevertheless, I'm grateful that they're not being framed within that, you know, the kind of Christian Judeo mythology.
Yeah.
That it's sort of slightly detached from that, and also because of the mythology of, you know, Mother Susperiorum and, you know, whatever, is that actually those are you know, kind of icons of faith which seem really old, that seem to sort of predate, you know, kind of a lot of more kind of contemporary theology in some ways.
Sure.
They feel that way, and I think particularly at the end of the 2018 one, that there's just the very setting of the kind of basement sort of space. It feels much more kind of, you know, archaic and, you know, kind of primeval almost in that, which, you know, is interesting, I think. So
there's loads of things that are fascinating about that movie, and I think, by the way, we should just say, for people who haven't seen it, when we mentioned Tilda Swinton earlier, playing Helena Marcos at the end. Yeah, she does. She also has other roles in the film.
Yes.
And in fact, when she plays Madame Marcos, she's encased in a ton of makeup. And I didn't know it was her straight away. And I think Tilda Swinton enjoys doing things like that.
Yeah.
She's bloody good at it as well.
She is.
She's very good. Yeah, fantastic. So, Kirsty, where do you want to go from here? Have we covered everything you want to cover in this week?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of horror, that yes, I think we probably have. But I want to just take a moment just to talk about the fact that the kind of representations of witchcraft are more diverse and perhaps a little bit more, kind of positively ubiquitous outside of horror. So I just wanted to, rather than just going to go, oh, this is all terrible, and as a witch I feel maligned and, kind of persecuted by modern media, I wanted to just take the moment to just talk about the way in which these characters exist in different spaces. So I've got three categories outside of horror to just talk about. So first of all, it's not uncommon now to have witches or witch characters being heroic or being the hero of stuff. So just very, very quickly, and no particular orders, Kiki's Delivery Service.
Yay!
So yeah, it's amazing. So it's Japanese Studio Ghibli anime film about a young witch moving to a kind of new town and sort of starting out on her own, using her magic to help people. I've not seen any of the next one, but my husband made me aware of it. There's a television series in America called Motherland, Fort Salem, where basically witches are used to protect the US using their witchly gifts. So there's Deborah Harkness's novel series, which is also a television series, A Discovery of Witches. But this is much more kind of witches being like, kind of supernatural beings rather than, kind of having a particular faith, although Harkness does kind of fold in those kind of elements of, kind of actual witchcraft and practice and tradition into her characterization. As we talked about earlier, Elsa from Frozen is, probably best understood as a witch character. And that's amazing. And particularly, I mean, I want to talk about next week, the way that I can hear myself again.
Yeah, the echo's back.
Oh. All right. Well, I'll cancel the call and re-call you again.
Alrighty.
I'll come back to that list.
Sec.
I don't know where it comes from.
It's weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
Really weird. I've not seen the new Sabrina.
No, I haven't either.
I've not watched it yet.
No.
I'm back now.
Hello. I can't hear myself, so that's good. So should we just go straight back in? Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you just mentioned Frozen.
Okay, so
I think.
So I'm Frozen, and I want to talk about next week about Frozen 2. There's a slightly different point. There's Sabrina the Teenage Witch, the 1990s sitcom, but also The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, which is the newer Netflix version of the same comics.
They are satanic witches, though, aren't they? Or at least in the new version.
Yeah,
they are.
Yeah. But she's still framed as
Sabrina herself.
Yeah, she's still framed as kind of the hero of that particular thing.
Right.
There's also, remember, Bewitched and Samantha. And I know you can't see me because it's a podcast, but I'm now twitching my nose.
Yes, so am I.
And of course, there's Charmed, which was, kind of came out in the wake of Buffy, didn't it? Yeah. But focused on three witches protecting the world, staving off apocalypse.
There's a new version of that, isn't there?
I think, coming, or I don't know.
I'm sure it's been trailed on E4, and it's on at 10 p.m. I've said that my daughter can't watch it, even though she probably really likes it, because she loves The Witch, that one. So
but do they still use How Soon Is Now as the theme music? That's what I want to know.
I don't know. Don't know.
Watch
We'll
this
find out.
space. So then I've got a slightly different list, which is witches as helpers or mentors. So where they're not the main character, not the hero, but are helpful to them along the way. So I was reminded recently of Dark Crystal because we watched the Netflix series, and I'm pleased to say
Yes,
that
I've seen some of them.
Aughra is still a really important character in that. And so again,
So is she in the film as well?
yes, she is.
Because
Really
I haven't actually
important.
seen the film.
What? Daniel,
Yeah, well, the new series is a prequel to the film.
it is,
so I
but
thought,
you
I'll
should
that
you
first.
should watch the film. But she is in the film. And she's amazing.
Okay.
And then there's Witcher, which obviously exists before Henry Cavill, and that Netflix version. But that has one character in particular who is defined as a witch, or at least has the characteristics of a witch and trains and all that kind of stuff, and has lots of power. And she's quite good.
So can I just ask,
Yes.
having never seen this programme, I feel like there's loads of things here that I've just not seen.
Yeah.
But, so it's called The Witcher.
Yeah.
It's based on a computer game,
Or
isn't it?
novels
Or is it a
that would
role-playing
then,
game?
yeah, and I think it was novels that then became computer games, which now is a Netflix TV series.
So The Witch isn't the main character.
No,
so
he's
who
a-
is The Witcher? What does that mean?
So,
Witcher.
a Witcher is he's like a demon hunter, but who has like supernatural strength, and yeah. There's more. I'm not overtly familiar with the mythology.
Is
You
he
can
the fellow
probably
who
tell.
dresses like Ross from Friends? I saw a meme.
Yes, yeah,
Like Ross
it's
from
basically
Friends in his leather trousers.
Henry Cavill with kind of gothed up, but with white hair and white eyes and a
That's it,
sword. Yeah. So he's a witcher, not a witch. But
Right.
there is another
Right.
character in the show that has magical powers, learns from kind of being at a school full of other women about how to kind of use their supernatural powers. But that's done in quite a positive way, I would argue. There's also, of course, Buffy, because
Yay.
Willow in Buffy becomes a witch. And what's interesting is that she's lined with Wicca, particularly, so that type of witchcraft, which apparently led to a bit of an explosion of interest in Wicca in America, particularly. Good Omens. Have we seen Good Omens? Do we know Good
I've
Omens?
not seen it
I
yet.
haven't seen it yet.
Okay,
no.
well you should, but there's a very, very funny treatment of both a historical witch and then a kind of descendant of hers in the kind of contemporary timeline. So that's one. And then also I was watching with my son, because he's obsessed at the moment, the other day, Moana. And I was thinking about Grandma Tala in Moana, who is the kind of, she defines herself as the village crazy lady. And she has a, kind of connection to the earth and to ancient wisdom. And she's the, kind of person who sends Moana or empowers Moana to go off on her journey. And I'm very much aware as I'm talking about this that neither of you have probably seen Moana.
No.
No.
I've seen some of it, but no, I haven't.
It's amazing.
not
It's
the whole
amazing. But so
I hear it's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and then finally, I've got just one other one to mention, which is where you have a witch who is sort of well-intentioned, is trying to use her power or their power for something good. So bed knobs and broomsticks. So the Angela Lansbury character, Miss Price, is a sort of kind of young witch, isn't she? And she's trying to use her witchiness, her witchcraft, to help with Britain's war effort. So
Right.
God, I've not seen that since I was a kid.
yeah, I was
I haven't seen it
reminded
for a
about
long
it,
time.
kind of researching this. So, but that made me think of and like there's a couple of news stories floating around at the moment about witchcraft and social media, but I'm going to ignore that one in order to talk about there was been quite a lot of kind of online witchcraft, kind of people coming together to go, hey, let's use our witchy powers and do things like hex Donald Trump and
Excellent.
and bad people
Oh,
and use it
if
as a sort of
only.
an activist way. So that I thought was a kind of nice line from Miss Price, trying to help the war efforts, and kind of witches online going, let's all do this ritual at the same time, trying to connect to the network of power in order to, I don't know, make his penis fall off, probably.
Yeah.
I mean, who knows if it's worked, but
sure it must have
exactly.
done.
Yeah.
That's why he's been such an arse.
So I'm aware of times.
Yeah, would he ever admit it?
No, probably not. No, in fact, he'd probably, try and, kind of have some sort of prosthetic that he'd have to show us so that we knew that that wasn't the case. Shudder.
See it as an opportunity.
Yes. Yeah.
God, yeah. You can do anything if you got money. Can I throw in a few other examples?
Please do.
As positive witches. So, there's Serafina Pekkala.
Oh yes,
I was going to say that.
Of course, Serafina. Yes. We love Serafina.
And I mean, she's an example of the supernatural, which, as you mentioned, with like the discovery of witches. And I mean, even though they are positive characters in that universe, I do think it's an interesting dichotomy that you've got with the portrayal of witches in the media, is that occasionally there are people with beliefs and practices more aligned with kind of real world witches, but other times they are kind of magical creatures that you would align with things like werewolves or
which is what
vampires,
which is what Discovery Witches does. Is it kind of goes, okay, well, there are these 4 races: humans, witches, demons, and vampires. And everybody's just got.
So, there are different races.
Yeah, basically. So I think this is. I mean, the kind of the sort of other responses I've got to this, I think probably can wait for next week, because they're kind of more general, as some, being somebody who's a witch and in a pagan way. But what I would say is just linking on to your point, really, which is the big problem we have in terms of representations of witchcraft is that there is often very little distinction made between what witchcraft actually is in the real world and the representations that are created in fiction. And they're created by people with very, very little direct experience of witches, witch culture and paganism. In fact, a lot of those representations are created by people who think that it doesn't exist. They're not, it's not, there's no basis in reality at all.
Exactly.
And so that's one of the fundamental problems in mainstream media and with the representation of witchcraft. In order for us to be taken seriously as kind of a spiritual identity and a culture and a people and traditions, is that there needs to be more actual representations of that in a realistic way. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love seeing a fictitious witch do her thing and use her power or their power. I'm not going to be gender specific about it. That's great, but it's fiction.
Yeah.
And so seeing some more realistic ones, representations would be good. That's what I would like. So please, somebody make something.
That's fair enough.
Yeah.
I'll just throw in a couple of other titles. Hocus Pocus.
Oh yes.
I've never seen it, but I've always wanted to, and just somehow got around to it. And also, this is a weird one, but I just thought, what's Mary Poppins if she's not a witch?
She is, absolutely. But of course, she's not defined in those terms, though, is she? She's, and that is part of the reason why she's allowed to exist as this sort of kind of magical being in the, kind of positive Disney pantheon, because she's not, defined in those terms. And even when Elsa gets called a witch, I think it's the Duke of Weselton calls her a witch, as he's sort of condemning her as she's kind of leaving the castle. So that's not a witch as in her claiming her kind of her witchhood for herself. She's it's a an accusation, a condemnation of her.
It's flung at her as an insult, isn't it?
It is.
And you do mention elsewhere The Craft.
Yes.
Which it is sort of a horror film.
Yeah. It has those elements, doesn't it?
And
I love The Craft.
And that's which is due for a remake, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the thing with The Craft is that it's again, it falls into that category of sort of heightening kind of, witch abilities and practices, but not. I think it's one of those films that has been taken always quite close to the hearts of many people who identify as witches, particularly people my age, because it often, I think it was 96, 97.
Yeah.
So it kind of comes out that kind of formative time. Yeah. And it, and it promotes the idea of kind of female community and solidarity. But it does make a really good kind of point about the kind of the intentions of the practitioner, the intentions of the witch. So you have the kind of clique of of kind of gothy girls, and the Fairuza Balk character, who I love Fairuza Balk, who is ultimately the one who sort of kind of goes down the wrong path, and it's very clear that it's the wrong path, and we know that. But what's interesting though as well, it feeds into, I think, an insecurity within a lot of certainly kind of witches that I've spoken to, is that the Robin Tunney character, who is she's the lead, and she's the kind of ultimately the good witch. I think her representation is that she's she's a hereditary witch. So the kind of power is sort of, it's part of her lineage, part of her heritage.
She already has it, doesn't she?
Yeah. And I remember a few years ago, I was talking to a kind of an acquaintance who was aware of, sort of was into the same thing as I was, but we talked about that we live in fear of what we call the coming of the real witch. Like somehow our kind of claim to our identity, because we're not from come from a hereditary tradition or a hereditary line, that somehow we're not quite as good enough as those people, which we are, of course. It's our own sort of self-doubt. But the craft sort of feeds into that kind of idea of the importance of hereditary lineage in pagan culture.
Kirsty, that's absolutely fascinating stuff. Are we ready to leave off next week?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that's an amazing grounding in the history of the society, the cultural representations, and particularly, of course, the horror representations of witchcraft. And thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
It's really, really engrossing. And, of course, there's still more to come. Yep. So next week we'll talk about paganism more generally, away from the idea of the witch, which itself has got huge amounts to get into, and huge amounts of representation in terms of horror films, again, especially with the emergence in just the last few years, really, of folk horror as a genre. I think paganism feeds into that a great deal. Yeah. So we'll discuss that, and we'll discuss it with reference to Midsommar and The Wicker Man, which will be really interesting. And but that's where we'll leave it for now. So thank you so much, Kirsty.
No, thank you. It's been really fab.
That's been great. All right, so we're coming to the end of our episode, even though it's been a bit of a bumper episode this week. And it's been great fun as such. And if only we had this much time all the time. But so we normally do our recommendations at the end. I'll go first, if that's okay, because my recommendation is a bit of a cop-out. So it's best just to get it out of the way. On YouTube, there's rather a good channel called Good Bad Flicks. Are either of you familiar with that?
No.
Just an American guy who does little kind of documentaries about often quite obscure horror films that he likes and argues why they're good. I mean, for instance, an example I'll give is that he does a little film about The Fly 2 and really robustly defends it. I pretty much hate that movie, which was co-written by Mick Garris. I'm going to say Mark Gatiss then. That'd be different. And just kind of links back to we were talking about Mick Garris last week. But this guy is really, his arguments are intelligent and impassioned, and he gets you to look at movies in a different way. So I'm not saying that he made me want to reconsider my opinion of The Fly 2, but I certainly found his video on it to be very interesting. Anyway, he's just done a video about a film called Galaxy of Terror, which is a horror film that I've never seen, but I'd heard of because I know that it's one of the kind of slots of oh dear, I've just used a word I didn't want to say. I don't know what word I was going for.
Well, it wasn't that one though, was it?
That might have been slew.
Slew, yeah.
I'm going to say
slew.
that again.
I'd keep.
Yeah.
Don't cut that out, Dan. Keep it in.
It was. Oh, all right then, just for you. Yeah. Or I think what I was doing was combining the word slew with gamut.
Oh.
Anyway.
Yeah.
It's out there now.
But anyway. Glut. That's
Glut,
what it was.
yeah.
But anyway, in
slew.
the early 80s, after Alien came out and was a success, there's a whole bunch of very low budget, pretty terrible Alien rip-offs came out. One of my favourites is called Inseminoid, and that title alone gives you an idea of how good some of these films are.
Oh yeah.
So I'd heard of Galaxy of Terror as being one of those. It's a low budget movie from Roger Corman Studios. But what I didn't realise is that although he didn't direct it or write it, possibly the most powerful person on the set of it was James Cameron.
Oh.
And this was before he directed a movie. I think he was employed as an art department person, but somehow because he was just very organised, he rose to kind of control the production. And gathered a load of the crew together for it, who he would later use on his own movies. So in a way, it becomes a really significant movie in Hollywood history, because obviously Cameron went on to direct some of the biggest blockbusters of all time, but also, particularly for me, loving the Alien movies. You know, basically, if Galaxy of Terror had not been made, then Aliens... Well, or the sequel to Alien would have been very different, because Cameron used a lot of the techniques and a lot of the crew that he learned on Galaxy of Terror to put Aliens together. So that video is really interesting. Also, I've discovered that you can actually see the film itself, Galaxy of Terror, on Netflix at the moment. So if you watch... and I say this advisedly, I haven't seen Galaxy of Terror. I suspect it's not very good. But if you watch the Good Bad Flicks video and find it fascinating, then the movie's there if you want to find out what they actually managed to put together. And I think I am going to do that. So it's kind of not really a recommendation fully, but I'm just kind of saying some interesting stuff that's out there for people so inclined. Who'd like to go next?
I'll go next. So I've got a couple of things that are creepypasta related. So I noticed this week that the Slender Man film has finally landed on Netflix.
Oh, yeah.
And if anyone's not aware of Slender Man, then they should go and check out all the videos made by Marble Hornets on YouTube. So they sort of progress the Slender Man myth forward. So yeah, the Slender Man movie is on Netflix, and check out all the Marble Hornet stuff on YouTube. And then related to that, on Amazon, on Prime Video, so you can also see a series that's called Channel Zero, that was based on a variety of creepypasta stories, one of which is Candle Cove. And if you fancy giving yourself the heebie-jeebies, just Google images Candle Cove teeth, and you'll see the creature that's made entirely out of teeth, and it's utterly terrifying. It makes this terrible clacking sound as it moves. But yeah, so Channel Zero is about a man who returns to the hometown that he left when he was a kid because his brother was murdered. And old memories come to the surface, and another child goes missing after mentioning that they've been watching a show called Candle Cove, which is a creepy children's puppet show that he used to watch on TV when he was a kid. So this whole Candle Cove thing came about as a creepypasta story, and then somebody on YouTube made Candle Cove, and it's all these weird pirate puppets, and it came from a story where I think the original creepypasta was something along the lines of people talking in this forum about this imaginary TV show Candle Cove, and then when one of them asked their parents about it, they were said, well, no, you just used to stare at the TV when it was just snow, like the show didn't exist. And that's just a little creepy hook on the original creepypasta, but it got made into a YouTube sort of user generated content, and now it's been made into a series called Channel Zero that was originally done by the Sci-Fi Channel. It's really good. monster made out of teeth is horrific, and it's definitely worth a look. And I would also like to add on to this that in the future of this podcast, I would like us to do an episode on some creepypastas, because that would be great.
That would be great.
Right. That sounds fun to me. Every few weeks, Stella, you give me a reason to extend my Amazon Prime subscription.
So desperately trying to end it.
Are you in the employ of Jeff Bezos?
Not sponsored, but as with Shudder, if you do want to sponsor us, our price will be low.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Really?
true. No, what are you talking about? We want loads. That's fantastic. And I'll just add, I've seen Marble Hornets, which is a whole channel on YouTube,
Yeah, it's great.
isn't it?
It's really, really good.
And it's ingenious and very chilling.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a better recommendation than mine. Kirsty, what's your recommendation?
My
this week?
recommendation is only because I just spotted it when I was looking for recommendations. Is that Prevenge, Alice Lowe's film that we talked about in our female. Yeah. So that's currently on Amazon Prime, and if you haven't seen it, you should, because it's amazing, and it's a very singular film.
It's excellent.
Yes, so that's my recommendation for this week.
Yeah.
Yep. Seconded.
Like The Witch, it's a great example of low-budget horror filmmaking. Like The Witch, it's got Kate Dickie in it. Unlike The Witch, I really love it. So, yeah, I can heartily second that recommendation, definitely.
Yes.
Wasn't Alice Lowe pregnant at the
She
time
was,
as well?
Yeah.
She was, wasn't she?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So particularly impressive, for that.
Yeah.
But, yes.
Yeah, amazing. So, well, that sounds like a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Kirsty.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsty.
Thank you, Stella.
Thank you both.
This has been a fascinating discussion, and I'm looking forward to having the second half of the discussion next week. So we'll be here this time next week, listeners, and you already know what's coming up, so I don't have to tell you. Thanks very much for listening. Thank you, Stella and Kirsty, and see you all again soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
You have been listening to And Now the Podcast Starts. Produced and released by Ambidextrous Solutions Limited. Presented by Kirsty Warrow, Stella Gaynor, and T.D. Velasquez. Special thanks to Greg Hume for our original theme music, and to Brian Gorman for our original artwork. All dialogue and music clips from films, TV shows, and trailers are used for the purposes of criticism, in the spirit of fair dealing as defined in UK law, and fair use as defined in US law. No copyright infringement is intended. Please visit our home on the web, www.andnowpodcast.com, for more content and contact details. Or visit our Facebook pages at AndNowPod or at Lee Cushing Pod. Follow us on Twitter at AndNowPodcast or at Lee Cushing Podcast. If you'd like to donate to us, please visit patreon.com/AndNowPodcast. And now the podcast stops.